You are listening to the SDSU Football Podcast, presented by the East Village Times, with your hosts Andre Hagverdian and Paul Garrison. Welcome, listeners, to the SDSU Football Podcast. Thank you for checking out this episode. I am your host, Andre Hagverdian. We are less than 4 weeks away from the start of the 2022 season, which is also the opening of Snapdragon Stadium. Over the past several weeks, Paul Garrison and I have brought you several articles and episodes as part of our season preview series. Paul wrote articles on each of the 5 offensive positional groups, and we put out episodes that detailed or chronicled our interviews with offensive coordinator Jeff Hecklinski. I wrote 3 articles related to the special teams, and we put out our interview as a podcast episode with special teams coordinator Doug Deacon. Paul and I were also fortunate to catch up with defensive coordinator Kurt Mattix prior to the start of fall camp to go through each of the positional groups on his side of the ball. Recently, I published an article on the linebackers, and Paul published an article on the defensive line. So in this episode, we wanted to give you the first half of our interview with Coach Mattix, which talked about kind of his overall picture view as they're heading into fall camp on a high level defensively, plus talking about the defensive line and linebackers. As always, Coach Mattix brought the knowledge and wisdom, and we were along for the ride. I know you will enjoy it. We want to welcome Coach Mattix back on to the SDSU Football Podcast. How are you doing today, Coach?
Doing great, guys. Thank you for having me on.
No problem. We spoke to you earlier this year at the beginning of spring camp. You were talking about ideally wanting to have 2 players at every position that played. There's this narrative that group of 5 teams don't have the depth Power 5 teams have, but your goal would say otherwise. So is SDSU in a position where it can have 22 legit Division I players on defense?
Great question. And I would say yes. And it might not be, there might be a little bit of a talent gap or a size gap, or maybe a little bit of speed or twitch gap between prospect or player A versus player B. But without question, that's, part of, what as coaches, you spend a significant amount of time on the season, then you spend a significant amount of time in recruiting. And we're always trying to find in the recruiting process the next Cam Thomas, the next Jonah Tavai, the next Caden McDonald, as we continue to evaluate who and what players have been successful here and continue to try to, get as many of those guys currently on a roster to create the most competition that you can have. And so, if you sit here and say, well, who's Jonah Tavai's backup, or who was Cam Thomas's backup last year? It could have been Sefo, it could have been Kahi, it could have been Jalil Leckie. And we all know that all 3 of those young men as seniors contributed very well within their role, but they were not able to play as high of a level of football as a Cam Thomas would. And so as you're looking for your 22, you might look at, like a Vaikaho, for example, and as a younger guy, not playing very many defensive snaps as much as special team snaps, Michael Shawcroft's a better football player right now as a senior in the amount of snaps he's played, but we're hoping Vaikaho with, some game ready reps and getting a chance to play can provide a good backup and not defensively, not take that big step back that when he has the opportunity to play in the field. And I think each position, whether it be defensive line, linebacker, or safeties or corners, have a little bit of different depth. If you look at our corner depth, you're sitting here saying, okay, Des Malone had a great spring. Dallas Branch played really well during the season. Injuries and some other things limited a contact during spring. Noah Avenger had a really good freshman campaign, similar situation as far as contact during the spring. But Noah Tumblin had a good spring and had a pretty good fall as well. And then going back to Avenger and Branch had good falls. So you're sitting here saying that could be four good people that are rotating in, having good depth, trying to play the hot hand at any given moment. So I think each position is a little bit differently, but without question, the more that you can create identities for each player, they know their role, they know how they're going to contribute, there'll be more buy-in, and in return, not only help us defensively, but hopefully help us on special teams and create the best 11 players on the field every single snap we can have.
Yeah, just talking more about kind of that depth and that, how do you go about deciding how many reps in a game someone gets and then the substitution patterns? I know last year you guys did a lot of 3-man substitutions on the line and things like that. How do you go about deciding that stuff?
That's a little complicated to a certain extent. Sometimes it's certain guys do really well in certain situations. So let's just take like a Dom Oliver. Dom Oliver, unfortunately had a season-ending injury in fall camp last fall, but this spring he showed that he has the ability to pass rush. So, you go into a situation where you say, okay, it's 3rd down and long. We're going to put Dom Oliver on the field in those situations to allow him to play to maybe one of his strengths. You look at a guy like New Zealand Williams, who is transitioning to a linebacker now, and you sit here and say, well, what are his strengths? Well, his strengths are covering and being able to play in space because he still has a safety speed, but, we just don't, we feel like he'd better help us at linebacker and get on the field a little bit quicker rather than playing behind a Patrick McMorris, who's, hopefully doing some good things for us. Well, now, again, another 3rd down and long or 2-minute or, passing, we're playing last year Nevada or for future Colorado State, style offense. He might be in a game a little bit more because of his ability helps us perform well against those teams because of his skill set. So, for me at linebacker, usually it's throughout the week who played well in the last game, as well as who has a good week of practice. And there were several times, like Michael Shawcroft, take him, for example, he had a heck of a week of practice, heck of a game production-wise and stuff like that, but he was just beat up a little bit. So he doesn't get the amount of snaps he needs from preparation just because of his body and things of that nature, but he's still going to do a good job. So it's not fair to maybe a Saguna Luby that he takes all those reps in practice and Mike's limited a little bit. And so we're going to start Sagoon, but we're still going to play Michael because, as the week went on, he, got better, because of rehab and treatments and things of that nature, that it takes the toll on your body because it's a physical game. You take Katie McDonald, Cam Thomas, Keyshawn Banks, or Jonah Tavai. Those are all guys that have proven to be very good pass rushers and 3rd downs. So even though Caden might be in a rotational deal like last year with Garrett Fountain, we wanted to put Caden back on the field in those critical 3rd downs, or as we call them, money downs, to try to get off the field and get your bag of money because we made a play on the quarterback, so to speak.
So on a day like today, when you had a member of your defense at every single level get voted to the preseason all-conference team, I want to ask the opposite question. Where does the defense need to improve on in 2022 to reach the level that they've been playing at the last few years?
Yeah, great. I appreciate that question, Paul, because again, that's a great credit to, again, San Diego State, the recruiting that they've done, the commitment from, Adam Hall, our strength coach, as well as the continuous culture from Coach Long to Coach Hoke, as far as continuing to try to do the same thing defensively. But I would say, to be flat out, we got to be better in the red zone. From a national average and things of that nature. I know points per game and things of that nature, we had good scoring defense. But from a overall red zone perspective, those are things that really hit home for me. Like, hey, we have to be better at that. We have to hold them to field goals and or put them in bad field goal positions where they might miss a couple. So that'd be number one, red zone defense. Number two, I would say our pass defense. Again, if you look at a national average, our pass efficiency defense is really what was good. A stat that you felt like, okay, we can compete with that, but the yards per game at times was not good overall nationally. So those are some things within the back end. And you graduated Tariq and a good group of seniors a year before. And yes, Trenton was back, but this was sort of Pat's first go around, and some other guys, CJ and Barfield, some of those new guys within the system, game reps and the amount of plays they played, just a little bit different. We're looking to try to capitalize that. I felt statistically rushing defense was good. Third down, there's opportunities for improvement there, even higher, and then total defense and putting it all together. I think our first year, the COVID year, we did very well with limiting yards per play versus play that we had to defend. It was very limited, like maybe 3 points something. And for a while, Mike May was talking about, hey, this is a really good stat. This is this. And I'm like, oh, didn't really know that was really a stat. But, those are things that you sit here and say to yourself, well, if we can limit the yards per play, we can keep them out of the end zone scoring. Those are things that I think that we can put our hat on and say, hey, this is what. Now, I'm also going to say, going into fall camp, Paul, all bets are off, man. We're running to the ball. We're creating a great philosophy as far as fundamentals and techniques. We're going back to the basics. So even though you sit here and say Jonah, Keyshawn, Caden, and Pat, those guys are guys that we're going to count on and stuff like that, it still is going to take more than those four guys. You have to replace a Cam Thomas tackle for losses and sacks. You have to replace a guy like Taylor Hawkins, who at times I think shut down about half the field as a corner. A guy like Trenton Thompson, who was able to come in and move to the field warrior position, which was Tariq's role for 4 years, and earn first team conference the first time in his whole career. So we know that that's a primary position that we have to get filled. And so it's like one of those things where we still have a lot to prove. And the one thing that Coach Hoke and Coach Hall, our strength coach, do an amazing job of is sitting here saying, last year, let's go out and create an identity of who we want to be. Let's go out and create an identity of who we're going to be. And it starts with the first day with a pursuit drill, running to the ball and understanding that that's going to be one of our core fundamentals as far as the defense, running to the ball, playing with great fundamentals, being tough, all those things from that standpoint.
That's terrific. So just jumping to like the specific groups, we'll talk first about the defensive line. I mean, you talk about, having their own identity, being their own group. What is the strength of the D line, and maybe what is an area of improvement for them going into camp?
Okay. So I would just say the strength of that is I think a little bit of our depth is our strength. Being able to play is, again, that's part of, again, Coach Hoke's philosophy as far as trying to play and keep people fresh. But I do also believe that we have some playmakers in that room, whether it be Jonah Tavai, whether it be Keyshawn Banks, that proved that last year. And then a couple, wrinkles under the covers that no one really knows about would be like a Justice Tavai that we think had a really good spring and is really coming around and learning our system and knowing that. A guy like Garrett Fountain, who, we made that position transition, and he's bought in and putting on some good weight and still moving like the outside linebacker he was for us. Some dark horses, whether it be like a Nasir Sims or a Wyatt Drager or a Dan Opoco or a Devin Lamp. So you talk about good competition, and then hopefully through good competition, their performance raises. I know Coach Enna and Coach Hoke and Mike Linehan, we constantly stress fundamentals. We constantly stress being tough and holding the point in some of the things that we're doing schematically. And I think from that, it's going to help breed competition. They know if they're going to play, they got to play well. And if they know they're not going to play well or not do their assignments or play and make the plays, then their snaps are going to be limited. So it creates accountability within that. And I look at a guy like Keyshawn and I look at a guy like Jonah and talk about the leadership, not only for just the defensive line, but as a whole defense or even a whole team, the amount of snaps that they've played and what they mean to our program, is just priceless. But you can't put anything on that just from the standpoint of, what they mean on a daily basis, how they go about their work, the type of leadership they provide. And again, it's sometimes vocal and sometimes it's just watched how hard they work. And you're going to sit here and be like, okay, this is what it takes to be successful.
Looking at the post-spring depth chart, Jonah Tavai was listed as a starter at DE and DT. with his brother as the OR at DT, and then Garrett Fountain as the OR at DE. Could you explain kind of the rationale for that, and where do you actually see Jonah playing?
To be honest with you, Andre, I see him playing at both. The one thing, I'm not trying to make light of it, but at times he could be vertically challenged if you get a chance to talk to Jonah. But that being said, watching him go against BCD, one of our right tackles in our offense, who's 6'8", 6'7", 6'8", the actual leverage based and power based that he has coming off an edge can give taller offensive tackles a problem. Now, again, you talk about a reach advantage that maybe they have, but you're still getting a 285, 290 pound athlete that can really do some really special things. And I really believe the way that Jonah's training now, he's gonna do some stuff that's people are gonna like, where did this guy come from, and all this other stuff. And not that people don't already say that, like, he's a good football player, but I think statistically and number wise, we're going to try to do some things with him and get matchups that's going to allow him we're going to allow him hopefully to get those matchups that we like and do that. But yes, if we had to start today, it's going to be Garrett or Jonah. And again, not that we've talked as a staff or anything like that, but as we ended spring, we said Garrett has done enough to sit here and say he's done a nice job. But I also know that Jonah is athletic enough to do both. The biggest thing is, where's Justice at? Can Justice replace us? Because schematically, we always like to be as good as we can be from nose on back. And so you look at your nose guard to your Mike linebacker to the Aztec of our defense, and in that order. And you want to be good right down the middle, and then have good edges to your defense and funnel everything back to your better players. So that might mean, hey, we're going to go Garrett, Jonah at nose, and then, so on and so forth, all the way back to our Aztec. But we definitely feel like, and that's a position like, that Cam Thomas always loved to go back to. He'd come talk to Coach Oak, hey, can I go back to nose? And some of that was just pass rush matchups and things of that nature that, Coach Oak and Coach Enna and myself will try to sit here and say, like, hey, where can we win with Jonah and can create that matchup? But, on game one against Arizona, if everything holds tuition, it could be Jonah and Justice at tackle and, Keyshawn at the other end. And that's our starting lineup going into that game.
You talked a lot about Garrett Fountain and his ability to potentially be the starter at end. How did his transition from linebacker to defensive line go through the spring and then in the summer?
Well, I think it's still a work in progress, and he is still a young football player for us. I look back and I wish I would have played him a little bit more. The problem is Caden McDonald can be a pretty good football player. So you're sitting here saying, take Caden off the field to play Garrett. Well, you look at the Utah game, he had, I think it was 2 sacks in 6 plays. And you're sitting there saying, well, hey, moron, put him in more, maybe he'll get 4 sacks in 12 plays, type deal. That being said, I think Garrett is a young man that is so coachable, so for San Diego State. And, he's a very hard worker and a very determined football player that's willing to try to be a people pleaser. And so from that standpoint, he's going to do whatever the team asks him to do, whether it be put on a little bit of weight, whether it be, this or that. And the main thing for him is he wants to play more. And so to get on the field more and to sit here and say, hey, this is what I want to do. I want to get on the field more. Similar to Hawkins 2 years ago, he's one of our best, 15 or 14 players overall. How can we find a position to get him on the field more, to get more snaps? And that's what we felt would be an opportunity to get him more snaps.
So there was a 4th and short play against Air Force where Keyshawn Banks and Jonah as well, but Keyshawn really got in there and jumped the snap. I've watched it 100 times. I still don't know how that happened, except that, Keyshawn has made the same kind of instinctual play that nobody else seems to be able to make throughout his career. What are you expecting from him this year?
To be honest with you, I don't really know. What I want from him is 1 or 2 tackle for losses per game, at least 1 sack per game, and just be a guy that sets the edge. I think he has the world at his hands. He's extremely smart. He prepares very well. He's a very athletic guy. Sometimes he, struggles a little bit with getting his feet in the ground as far as left, right at times, meaning like, hey, he maybe takes a little bit of a too long of a stride, which maybe he doesn't play the block perfectly, but he's sudden, he's twitchy, he's athletic, he's tough. And, I really believe that he came into his own last season. And part of that was because he had a great off season versus the COVID year type deal that, just everybody was a little bit in the haze in a way, I guess. But he also came out, that, they're trying to maybe run away from Cam a little bit, and he was able to capitalize on that. That being said, I sit here and say to myself, well, if we can get Jonah on the edge, Justice is strong in the middle, where you want to run the ball. Okay. And we feel pretty good at our linebackers as far as being able to have edges. And then you have Pat protecting us in the back end to, cap the defense off. Where do you want to run the ball? And so I just think, consistently for him, I don't have the stats in front of me. Let's say, like Arizona, he has 2 or 3 tackles for losses, a sack, a couple hurries. Boom. That's a great game. What we got to make sure he does is next week against, Idaho State, he has that same stat line. It can't be one of those where it's, we're going to be really good here and then not as consistent here. And then the next game, hey, I didn't have as good of a week. Well, we got to be as consistent as we can be. And that's the one thing I talk about, I keep bringing Cam up because he was such a pleasure to coach. That's what I felt like he provided for us last year, a consistent playmaker where it was like, and if you ask Cam, he'd be like, oh, I should have made this player. I could have made this one. They're their own worst critics. But I think if we can get a consistent production out of Keyshawn that we were able to get out of Cam, I do believe we'll get a consistent production out of Jonah. Now it's the combination of, hey, maybe it's Cooper McDonald. Hey, maybe it's a Justice Divide. Maybe it's a Garrett Fountain, to get some of those extra plays that I think that will really help Keyshawn continue to make plays. There's nothing worse than having an elite defensive end on one side, and not only is the tackle sitting on him, the tight end's going to sit on him and chip him, or maybe even the running back chips him because we don't help Keyshawn out. And that's our job as coaches, to provide, good recruits and good people that can rush on the other edge. And I think if we can rush, maybe Caden at times, Cooper at times off the edge, I think that they're going to provide a good rush. So maybe, whether they slide to Keyshawn or whether they slide to, those guys, it's going to create some matchups for them to be successful.
Devin Lamp, he missed spring. I think, when he was brought in, anyone who's brought in and at that level of a transfer at the end of their playing time, but on the depth chart, he was listed at 3rd or 4th, tied for 3rd. Was that strictly because of him not being available, or was just some things you haven't seen from him? And what should the Aztec fans be excited about with his game?
Yeah, it is strictly just based on the fact that he was coming off a, injury and was not able to participate, in the spring. It has nothing to do with, anything other than that. Just don't really know exactly. We've had a chance to be around Daniel Opoco for, multiple years. Same thing with Dylan Taylor. So that's sort of where that sort of sits. And what we expect out of Devin Lamp is just a guy that's going to play with a good motor. He reminds me a little bit watching him run around like a Jalil Leckie, but a heavier Jalil Leckie, being able to come in and play multiple. I mean, that was one of the things that Coach Hoke really liked at times, was to put Jalil at the nose position. And you're like, what? He only weighed about this, but that makes that guy move his feet. And now it's a one-on-one matchup at times because the guards will overset for Keyshawn or Cam. So now you get that one-on-one, and he's athletic and was able to beat them at times. So I think the biggest thing for Devin, he's learning the system. That's another thing when you don't get very many reps or don't take any, you just got to learn what we do defensively and schematically and the movements and stuff. But athletically, he's there. He's got some good twitch. He's got a great mindset as far as being a good worker. And, he's adhering to, the good leadership that Keyshawn and Jonah are presenting to him.
We've talked a lot about those top 4 guys that are vying for starters. If the season started today, who would you see as that 5th or 6th guy that would be getting that backup role reps?
Well, I think a little bit depends on what the position is. So, like if it's an inside guy, you could go Nasir Sims or Darian Dalton, as far as the inside guys, as far as within that, whether it be Jonah, Justice, those 2 guys that really had good springs and look are running well and doing some things of that nature. But the other guys at ends, you got to go Wyatt Drager, had a limited role for us last year. But again, accountability, dependability, tough, and does things the right way. Dan Apoko, again, is another guy. I thought he had a great spring. And, Coach Hoke does a great job of, I don't want to say protecting players, but, limiting snaps at times in the spring, knowing, hey, they got their work in. Let's get some other younger guys some snaps to see how they handle situational football. And I think Dan took as much advantage of that as he could and presented himself as a guy that when he's healthy, he could be a terror as well. And then I'd probably say the last guy besides, like Devin Lamp would be Dylan Taylor. And I think, unfortunately for Dylan Taylor, last year was doing some really good things and then hurt his shoulder a little bit. And that set him back for about 2 weeks, just mentally, and then he realized that he could still play with it, just put a brace on. And then he was able to, do some good things, but it almost was like the season almost got too much for him. And then just some other things that happened, in the process of injuries. But I do believe that Dylan Taylor's a guy. So you're sitting here saying Keyshawn, Apoko, DT or Lamp, our group. And then, like I said, Jonah, Justice, Nasir, Dalton, and then Tavai again, Jonah, Fountain or Drager are guys that I can sit here and say, you're talking about, 3 deep or at least 2 deep. You sit here and say, hey, that's going to be a constant rotation. And again, going back to the way that Coach Hoke and Coach Enna set it up, you might see early downs with certain guys and then critical downs, with the, some of the other guys that we try to do as games go on.
Moving on to linebacker, in the spring, we talked about Caden potentially, moving more inside to expound that part of his game. But he's just like Jonah, he's listed as the starter at 2 different spots, inside and outside. Could you explain kind of the thinking behind that and how you see that unfolding?
Sure. And part of it's, again, going back to who's the idiot who's calling the defense, and you take a 2-time first team all conference Sam linebacker and you move him a position. So part of it's that. So I'm allowing you, Andre and Paul, not to call me an idiot with that position change. But
never would do that.
I think part of it is just what Cooper McDonald has presented. I mean, Cooper McDonald, has had a good summer. He had a really good spring. There were some things that he did in the middle of practices at times where I'm like looking around, like, did we get that videotaped? Because that was pretty doggone good. And, and he can pass rush. He can set the edge. He can bend the edge. He could do some things athletically that Caden can't do. And which is fun because then you ride Caden like, oh, your younger brother's better than you, which he doesn't like at all.
Sure.
So it's part of the process. The next thing is Daryl Masani has coming along, and he's been in the program for a while, and I'm really excited to where he's coming and developing his body, as same as Dom Oliver. We just talked about him, getting hurt, so he missed all the season, and this spring was not a fun spring for him. If you had to ask him, he'd be like, yeah, it was a rough spring. It was just getting back to the basics of football. So, not only did he have a COVID year that was hurt, he comes here and then gets hurt. And then, so it's just like learning how to play the San Diego State way. I think our best Sams will be probably the McDonald brothers. And then from there, and Daryl will have a role, and same with Dom. But from there, you sit here and say, okay, who's our best Mike linebacker? Cedric Lakalaka is a good football player and has played a lot of snaps for us. And so if you're rotating, between those two, Caden and Seti, you feel like you're pretty good. You're rotating between Cooper and Caden, you feel like you're pretty good. And then that leaves, Michael Shawcroft with Seti again there. And you sit here and say, okay, I know Mike, again, I love him to death. He's one of my favorites, but he might get beat up a little bit. I mean, there's half the season he played with a brace. Half the season he played with a cast on his hand, and he's not going to stop playing. He's going to continue to push himself, but he might need a couple plays off. So it's a rotation with that mindset of saying, hey, we're a 4-man rotating linebacker, 2 at Sam's, and then rotate it Mike with Seti and Mike and go from there. First off the bench for me will probably be Vaikaho, who can play both Mike and Will again, but not really Sam. So that's sort of where Caden fits into it. If you had to say who are you starting against Arizona, probably my seniors. because it's the first time in Snapdragon Stadium, and I want them to probably have that experience, that experience with that. But Cooper comes out and he's bound to have a sack on the first play, type deal. And Coach Fish, does a lot of great things offensively with their staff. So that first play could be a double reverse pass that Cooper could get a sack on. So, I don't want to miss out on that opportunity either. So, but that's sort of where, if that makes sense, the Caden McDonald situation.
Yeah, that was really well said and explained. It does seem, you're describing all of these players, and there's a lot of experience. You mentioned the 3 seniors. Obviously, Cooper McDonald is a junior. But given this experience, should those 4 that you named first be expected to have kind of the lion's share of the snaps? Or do you think you're going to have as much of a rotation as you did last year?
Correct. And let me go back real quick, Paul, because I go back to, you use the term experience. Well, how do you get experience? You gain experience through playing multiple people. And now each year, as you're coming back, you're sitting here saying, well, wow, Vaikaho, I didn't know he played 250 snaps on, 1,000 play season. Or you look at Michael Shawcroft or this guy. And so now it goes back to, without question, I'm sitting here saying, hey, these 4 need to be on the field as much as we can. But I also want to sit here and say, I think Vaikaho can be a good blitzer. I think Vaikaho has a lot of energy, plays with passion. Sometimes we have to calm him down. Coach Hoke will probably have to put him back and have a nice conversation with Coach Hoke, maybe on the sideline, to calm him down a little bit. He loves to play the game and is fun to coach, and then get him back on the field pretty quickly. It's also creating competition on special teams. And when you got, again, another group of guys like the Masani guys, the Olivers, the Dylan Taylors, you got Zyrus and Cajo all running down on kickoff team. For 2 years, we haven't had to cover kickoff with Matt Ariza. Now we're having to start covering kickoffs. So now you're talking about guys that are playing legitimate snaps that can run down and cover the field. Like Kyron White, holy cow. Wait till you see him run down and cover and hit somebody. So those are the things. Yes, I feel like we got good depth and talent, but it's a mindset as a coach that you sit here and say, where can we put them in and how can we utilize them to gain good game experience? I'll sit here and say, hey, I was not happy with how we played in the game against Towson last year. That was one of my worst games I felt as a coach. But I also know that our offense, did a really great job and we had a good lead. So now you're getting a chance to play some guys that maybe wouldn't necessarily get the snaps against Utah or Arizona or maybe a Boise State in a good competitive, Mountain West game. So it's that process. And then through that, you develop trust, they develop accountability. And that's a big thing. Like I know this for a fact, Caden McDonald is going to go in that linebacker room in early in fall camp and be like, hey, this is how we're going to do things. And if you're not in it, then you're wrong. And that happens in the D-line room with a Jonah Tavai. And then you got Barfield and you got, Pat McMorris. They're doing those things in the back end. Guys that have played a lot of snaps know and have seen, what San Diego State does defensively, and they know what it looks like. And if they're not holding their end of the rope or pulling it with the right direction, then that's going to get corrected within our senior leadership.
You've been talking about Michael Shawcroft, but he's been a playmaker throughout his career. The ball always seems to find him, one of those, nose for the ball, whatever the right phrase is, just that he seems to be able to be there when turnovers, et cetera. He has had health problems, but if he's able to stay healthy, what kind of player is he capable of being?
Oh gosh, Paul, I couldn't even begin to tell you. Without question, again, a lot of times Caden McDonald's has gotten some recognition. I believe he's put the work in to deserve some of that. But Michael Shawcroft, if he got some of the same snaps that I think Caden's had and been able to be healthy, through certain deals, that I think, and he's been honorable mention. I think a lot of it's because of stats he's been able to put up in snaps. And he's also rotated with, Andrew Alecki or Saguna Luby, which, I think, ended up having really good careers at San Diego State. But I think Michael, number one, he prepares like no other. Okay, so he's an extremely smart football player. Number two, he has passion for San Diego State. if I'm not mistaken, his grandfather just got inducted into the Hall of Fame this offseason. Right. So you talk about the lineage, and he's a local guy, a San Diego guy that had a great career at Helix High School. And so now you're sitting here saying all these positive things. And now, I mean, it's just like, sometimes you struggle. And now, I'm hoping that this is going to be, he's going to get to the end of that rainbow with a pot of gold this year, because he deserves it. And he does everything right. And we have to make modifications at times to certain things so he could do things. You want to talk about, team first mentality. And again, there's only a couple captains that get picked, each year. But I look at Mike and say, you're just as big of a captain as anybody on our team, because I know if I say, hey, Mike, I need this, message to our defense that we're not playing hard and we're not tough as we need to be, I promise you he'll deliver that message the way it needs to be done and say, hey, we need to hold up our end of the deal. But I really believe, whether it be a couple interceptions, we always mess with him. Like he drops a couple balls in practice. I almost made him go put the cast back on that he got the interception in when he had the cast on his hand. So it was one of those things where he does it right. He's right where the ball needs to be. He's got a good nose because he prepares to be, and he believes in himself. And that's half the battle itself. Don't be afraid. Believe in what you're doing, the product that you're putting out, and know that it's going to be good enough.
What would you consider the biggest growth opportunity for the linebackers heading into fall camp, into the season?
I would say creating depth. As much as it is just the simple fact that things can happen against Utah. Caden strained his shoulder, let's just say, and so he was out half the part of that game until he was able to get it ready and come back in. That's when Garrett came in and did some really good stuff. But then Caden, I don't think had the season that he envisioned that he wanted to have if he would have been 100% healthy. So, you're talking about depth, and again, being that it's a contact sport and things can happen at times, you sit here and say, okay, where can we create depth? Well, Dom Oliver, I think he could be a really good pass rusher. So he might be a specialist in certain situations, maybe playing D-line, as one of the four rushers. So maybe it's Cooper and Dom on the field as pass rushers, and then Keyshawn and Jonah Tavai inside. You know what I'm saying? So doing certain things to help in that world with Daryl or Dom. You got like Zyrus Fiasu, who I think has done some good stuff on special teams in a limited role. He had a good spring. So getting an identity for him in, again, some depth positions and things of that nature. And then I think, to be honest with you, Andre, we got to make more plays. When we blitz, we got to make some more plays. And it may, if it's Caden or if it's Cooper, get a tackle for a loss, get a sack, get your hand on the ball, punch that ball out. And that will be obviously a point of emphasis always as far as getting the ball back. But if we can get a couple turnovers here or there, or, like Andrew Alecki scored twice on defense last year, and that was awesome. And we needed those points against UNLV. We needed those points. I can't remember against New Mexico State. I think it was first game of the season. So those were two critical plays that he made that we needed those points when it was all said and done. And it's an energy booster. It's excitement and fun and all that other stuff. Just no penalties afterwards, trying to go find that NFL camera to go get that poster made for you guys. So
you mentioned this briefly a little bit earlier, but we had to ask about it. I think the biggest wow studying that post-spring depth chart that Paul and I had was seeing New Zealand Williams as a linebacker.
Sure.
And even with Vi on as a third weak side linebacker. Could you just kind of talk a little bit more about that, the rationale behind that?
Yeah. Again, it's just, if anything, it's trying to find what we feel like what we want to do as a defense and become more athletic. I had this conversation with a couple of my buddies in this game. The game is defending 53 and a third. It's now, if you're going to go play Stanford, you're going to have to defend that box, and they're going to pound you, and they're going to do certain things with bigger people and so on and so forth. Last year, the Mountain West did not have other than Fresno, really, that lined up in two tight ends and really tried to run the ball down the field. And we didn't play Colorado State last year, which I think maybe they did do a little bit of that. But the teams that we play, whether it be Hawaii, Nevada last year, Fresno still like to throw the ball over the field. You have to have guys that can cover, and you have to be able to play in open space. And there was 2 or 3 plays, and Andrew Alecki is one of my favorite all-time players I've ever coached. But they just ran a hitch against UNLV a couple times in like a spacing route, And that slot receiver, Ryan Williams, made Andrew miss an open space, and he was able to go take a 5-yard hitch to about 10 to 12. And so if you have a little bit more of an athletic guy that can play in that position and play in space, why not? He can run, he can hit, he's physical. Those are all things that he does well. And then also sit here and say, how can we get our best 11 on the field? And we sit here and say to ourselves, hey, these are the things he does well. He's a good blitzer, he's aggressive, and he's a striker. Let's move him closer to the ball. And that goes back to, again, whether it be Hawkins, whether it be Saguna Luby, or, whoever the situation is trying to find that guy that, because some of the things we might do is we might have him cover a tight end. Well, Utah's tight ends, holy cow, they're as good as receivers. And so, but, New Zealand's coming from a safety position. That's what he had to cover a lot last year at times as the Aztec. And so that's not a matchup that you're sitting here saying, oh gosh, that's not a good matchup for us anymore. Now you're sitting here saying, I'll take that matchup. And now we can do some different things schematically that maybe we haven't shown, because now some of our linebackers are covering some skill set guys because that's what they do better.
One aspect of the Aztecs that interests me, football is a copycat game, and obviously, the staff will copy other teams, but it amazes me how much y'all copy yourselves. Like, you find what works for the Aztecs and then say, can we replicate that? Can we do that again? Everything that you're describing about New Zealand, did you get to see kind of a working model of that because of how Saguna Luby made that same transition during his career?
Sure. And that's what it is. I mean, it goes back to the same thing, Paul, as you're sitting there watching film, you're like, as a staff, you're like, okay, what are we doing? We're playing man coverage. We're blitzing. We're not necessarily getting home. Okay. And they have too much time to throw. What are we going to do? Let's make this adjustment. Let's talk through this. What can we do to become more athletic? This and that. Hey, it worked for Sagoon. Does New Zealand have the right mindset to be able to do this? And again, going back to our culture, Coach Hoke's culture about team first mentality. What do you want to do, New Zealand? I want to get on the field. Okay. There's a little bit of a difference between some of the linebackers and some of the defensive line that rotate a lot. One guy that we really haven't rotated a lot is Pat McMorris. Okay. And I think he got co-defensive player of the year, a preseason recognition, which I think he deserves that personally. He is an extremely hard worker. Again, a preparation guy, a team first mentality. And so we're going to sit here and say, okay, you might not play in any special teams, Pat, because you're going to play maybe almost every snap defensively. Well, now where are you going to play, New Zealand? What do you want to do? And so it goes back to the sense, hey, coach, I just want to be on the field. Okay, this is what we're going to try to do for you. We're going to put you in this position. You're going to do this. You're going to do that. It's the same as this. And so the learning curve is not bad. But again, it's just trying to find things like you're saying that we do well and try to capitalize that in those situations. There might be a team next year that we face that gets in 22 personnel, and New Zealand might not play a snap other than special teams. And then when you play Hawaii or you play, in a conference championship game, maybe Utah State again, and, New Zealand plays 80 snaps of the game because, now all of a sudden you have another defensive back that's on the field, but he's a little bit more aggressive at times. So it just goes back to, and, I love Caden McDonald again, but there was times last year at the end of Hawaii, at the end of Nevada, in those critical situations, we had a spy, which was Saguna Luby. Then it was Andrew Alecki, Michael Shawcroft, and Cedric Lakalaka were my three linebackers. Sagoon became, and Sagoon was technically a D lineman, but he was the spy because he could catch those quarterbacks. You know what I'm saying? So trying to find roles for those guys. And again, it creates competition. It creates accountability that they know, hey, I'm going to work my butt off and they're going to play me, and so on and so forth. So hopefully that, they know their role. Sometimes they're not always happy with their role. And I'm like, well, then work harder, beat that guy out, make more plays than that guy. And then we'll try to get you on the field more.
That was our first half of our interview with Coach Mattix with our season preview, looking at the linebackers and defensive line. We will be back with the second half of Coach Mattix's interview on a follow-on episode which talks about the cornerbacks and the safeties. The defensive backs will be looking to replace 2 starters, Trenton Thompson and Taylor Hawkins, from their 5-man group. So definitely keep an eye out on not just that podcast episode, but also our season preview articles on both of those positional groups as we get closer to September 3rd. As always, we appreciate all of our listeners for tuning in. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe, like, share, comment on all of your favorite platforms, and we will talk to you guys next time. Thank you. You are listening to the SDSU Football Podcast, presented by the East Village Times, with your hosts Andre Hagverdian and Paul Garrison.